Before I did the addiction work, I was for 22 years in family practice. So I saw a full range of medical conditions. I also was for 7 years the medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver's largest hospital. So I worked with dying people. And what I began to notice, and I couldn't no longer escape the awareness, that the people that develop chronic illness, for the most part, has certain personality characteristics that I saw over and over and over and over again. Now, nobody had taught me this. Later on, when I began to do the research, it turns out that other physicians had noticed this as well. In fact, had noticed it for hundreds of years and written it up, but it's never entered the medical education and still doesn't. So what did I notice? I noticed that the people that develop chronic illness, by which I mean autoimmune diseases like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, scleroderma, systemic lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic eczema, chronic psoriasis, chronic migraines, malignancy, Crohn's disease, inflammatory conditions of the gut as well, also have colitis, irritable bowel syndrome, endometriosis, or cancers of most kinds. What were the characteristics that I noticed? Number one, an automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own. So typically, a woman, and I can mention, she's diagnosed with breast cancer, and her first thought is, how will I support my husband through this anxious news? She's the one that's going to say radiation, chemotherapy, and so on. How will I support my husband? This is a newspaper article written by the same woman. I'm quoting her. So the first characteristic is this compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others. The second one is a rigid and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than, or as opposed to, while ignoring the needs of the self. Now, identity means that I identify. So that identify comes from the Latin word idem, which is the same, and facere, to make. So I make myself the same as my work. I don't know who I am if I'm not working. So I don't exist as a separate self. That's the second characteristic, this compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility. The third one is repression of healthy anger. There's the expression that the good die young. They do, because these very nice people are repressing their healthy anger. And everybody loves them. And when they die at age 45 of cancer or 50, everybody comes to their funeral and say how nice they were. It's because they repressed their healthy anger. And the fourth characteristic is the belief that you're responsible for what other people feel, coupled with the belief that you must never disappoint anybody. So those are the four characteristics. Now, right away, the question comes up, are you blaming people for getting sick? No, we're not. These characteristics are not anybody's conscious decision. They're automatic defenses or parts that came along in childhood in response to the environment. Mm-hmm. So I've talked about this the other day. I mentioned this tension between authenticity and attachment. So we need to attach, we need to belong, we need to be taken care of. If our family can't handle a healthy anger, if our family situation is such that we have to take on responsibility for, very often in the home of alcoholics, for example, a child will take on the caretaking responsibility, emotionally speaking, suppressing their own needs. So these beliefs and these characteristics, they're not who we are. It feels like who we are because we've been like that all our lives, as far as we recall, but actually they are adaptations where we surrender our authenticity in order to preserve our attachment relationships, without which you can't survive. So we're not faulting anybody here, but we're saying that if these characteristics run your life, you have a much higher chance of getting sick. Now, why is that the case? I'm not going to go into the physiology of it, but it really has to do with, you can't separate the mind from the body. And when you have these characteristics, you're creating unwittingly a lot of stress for yourself in your life, because you're always doing more than your organism can really handle. And that stress undermines your immune system, alterates your intestines, makes you depressed, and threatens your heart, supports diabetes, and so on. So this has to do with the mind-body unity, which the science of it has been elegantly worked out, but fundamentally the emotional system, the psyche, the nervous system, the immune apparatus, and the hormonal apparatus are not separate systems, which is how medical teaching portrays it. It's all one thing. When something happens emotionally, guess what? That has huge impacts on our physiology. And I may have mentioned the other day, or maybe I didn't. This is why, for example, a study a couple of years ago showed that women with severe PTSD symptoms have double the risk of ovarian cancer. Now, when it comes to working with this, if the person is guided to recognize these patterns and to let go of them, whether through parts work or whether through my compassion inquiry method, or whether because they just wake up and they don't want to be that way anymore, these diseases can be often mitigated. Now, I'm not promising a cure here, but I'm saying I've seen all kinds of examples of it. And that again, because the mind and the body cannot be separated. Now, from that point of view, disease, which I don't recommend it to anybody, can be a beautiful teacher if you're willing to learn. So in my new book, The Myth of Normal, there's a chapter called The Dreadful Gift, Disease as Teacher. And people learn, and what do people learn when they learn from their disease? They learn to be themselves for the first time in their lives. And again, it's not the way I recommend that people should learn, but that's how it works. And that's the final thing I'm going to say is that depends on how we look at illness. Now, if we look at illness as some foreign entity, here's my glass case, my glass container, here's me, I have it, I can put it down. But when you say I have rheumatoid arthritis, the assumption is there's an I, and then there's this disease called rheumatoid arthritis. And the two are separate. And rheumatoid arthritis is a separate existence from me, and it's going to do something to me. But what if there's no separation? What if the rheumatoid arthritis is my body's way of saying no to the way I've been living? Because I haven't said no to the world's expectations. I haven't said no to the world's demand that I not be myself in order to be accepted. And what if I learn to say no? Then maybe that process can be mitigated or reversed. And that's my basic assumption. So this is not just theoretical stuff. And so when you study people that have these spontaneous remissions, you find that there's nothing spontaneous about it at all. Whether they recover from ALS, which is almost always fatal, but there's actually recovery from it, documented, or from cancer, or whether the rheumatoid arthritis doesn't flare up anymore, whether inflammation of their skin or their intestines or their lungs settles, it's because inflammation is part of that process to which the emotions make a huge contribution.